Youth, youth. Was George Bernard Shaw right when he said that it's wasted on the young? When Shakespeare thought about youth, he thought about how poetry might go in search of that something, that essence that gives youth its beauty even after youth has passed, like the scent of a rose after its blossom has wilted. And so of you, beauteous and lovely youth, when that shall fade, my verse distills the truth. Who better to search for the essence of youth than an aging poet, a famous poet who spent his life guided by a rigid discipline, a kind of Protestant work ethic that he inherited from his father and that apparently is capable of taming the darker, more fiery impulses he inherited from his mother. Today we're talking about Thomas Mann, and we're reading his novella Death in Venice. Youth. You may still be young and wonder what it's like to watch your youth fade away as you get older. Or you may already be old and you must know what it feels like to have youth behind you. And you may still have the rest of your life in front of you, but it's going to be shorter, as a friend pointed out to me recently. Youth. This week we arrive at the writings of a true undisputed master of German literature, Thomas Mann. And let's pronounce his name the German way, not Thomas Mann, but Thomas Mann. Thomas Mann's aging poet in Death in Venice might very well have been Thomas Mann himself, even though he's only 37 years old when he writes the story. But in it we see an attempt to understand how age might relate to youth, and at the same time how art might relate to transience, and how to look for beauty, and once you've found it, what to do with it. Is beauty something aesthetic, something transcendental? Is it something erotic? How does it relate to age? How does it relate to the fact that human life is but transitory? These are the kinds of questions he raises in Death in Venice. The key word, of course, is beauty. The aging artist confronts beauty manifested in youth. The encounter with beauty is an encounter with desire, with the force it exerts on the aging mind and body, with sexuality, and with death. Thomas Mann was born in 1875. And as you know, remember Paul Heyse, this was just 4 years before the founding of the German Reich under Bismarck, and it was also a time of economic uncertainty. There'd been over 40 years of industrial and financial growth, and growth had created a thriving middle class throughout Europe. This was the age of the haute bourgeoisie. This was the age of the wealthy middle class, and it's reflected in literature. However, around the time Thomas Mann is born, things start to look different. There's been a lot of speculation on the financial markets, there's been a lot of surplus production, and the stock market has collapsed. The so-called Black Friday on the Vienna stock market, that was the 9th of May, 1873, saw a widespread panic concerning financial markets, rushes on banks, and 60 banks went insolvent. There were a couple of important consequences that are of interest to us. First of all, there's an increasing awareness that not all is well with unregulated capitalism. But then, how is capitalism supposed to be regulated? Is it to be regulated by a strong state? Certainly not by internal mechanisms, because the internal mechanisms are failing. But what is a strong state? Does it look fascist? Does it look socialist? Watch this space. The second important consequence for us is that there is a fundamental cultural crisis in the bourgeoisie, and it's going to mark the direction of art throughout the first half of the 20th century and beyond. On the one hand, the tradition of financially well-to-do middle-class men is noteworthy. This is the cultural marker of the successful bourgeoisie, the male industrialists, the bankers, the small businessmen, the doctors, the lawyers, etc., etc. These are the successful men, the pater familias, the ones who are driving the force of cultural progress. So it would seem. And they want to ensure that their sons follow in their footsteps. They want this progressive generation of successful men to continue. So the sons are supposed to get a good education, and they're supposed to pursue a good middle-class career. However, on the other hand, with wealth comes increasing leisure and patronage of the arts, and with an increasing awareness of the arts, we have a large number not only of successful male businessmen, but successful male artists. And I'm emphasizing the gendering of this process because the male artists of the time are very well aware that for them, artistic activity is a gendered activity. And what I mean by that is that they find themselves torn between the father's injunction to succeed financially and a sense of devotion to their artistic and sensitive mothers. This may involve a large degree of stereotyping, but this is certainly how it was perceived at the time. So this is a generation that acts out the contradictions in gendered stereotypes of successful men and sensitive women. And they do this alongside the realization that the artificial political superiority of men is under threat from new women. Remember, these are the grandchildren of Heise's generation. In 1901, Thomas Mann published his first great novel. It was called Buddenbrooks, and it had the subtitle The Decline of a Family. It tells the story over 4 generations of how a wealthy merchant family gradually loses its fortune. And alongside the financial decline, we see the increasing prevalence of sickly children, we see depression and insanity, what they called nervous afflictions at that time. But we also see the emergence of artists from the ruins of the declining bourgeoisie. This is a generation of successful artists, some of whom made a living from their art. Thomas Mann is in many respects reflecting on his own life circumstances. He's the son of a successful merchant in Lübeck in North Germany, and from childhood on he wanted to be a writer. He was only 14 years old when he signed a letter, Thomas Mann, lyrical dramatic writer. His father died when he was quite young, this was 1891, and he had stipulated that Thomas was to pursue a middle-class career. And so in 1894 he takes on a job as a clerk in a fire insurance company. But he wanted to write, and he was successful at his writing. That same year he wrote a short story which he gave the title Fallen, and he succeeded in having it published. It tells the story of a young man who's suspicious of the rising political and cultural demands of women. And he falls in love with a woman and experiences great disappointment when his lover turns out to be selling sexual favors for money. He concludes, "If today a woman falls out of love, tomorrow she'll fall for money." And so we have all the pieces in place for reading Death in Venice. We have the sense that middle-class wealth is at risk, or perhaps even just a thin veneer. We have the idea that art is more real, more essential than bourgeois respectability, but also it's riskier. And we have the crumbling of fixed views, fixed stereotypes of men and women. And we have the confounding of art with eros, sexuality. Around this time, Sigmund Freud was coming to the conclusion that what artists really want in life is fame, wealth, and beautiful lovers. Gustav Aschenbach has fame and wealth, and now he's faced with the epitome of physical beauty. But why death? Why Venice? Well, Venice, it's in Italy, and we know from Paul Heise that Italy was, for Germans, a land of promise. By the time Thomas Mann wrote, there was a long-standing tradition going back at least to the 18th century that saw Italy as the polar opposite of Germany. The land south of the Alps was a place of warmth, comfort, easy living. It was a place of innocence and abandon, and was somehow freed of the stodgy, conservative traditions of Europe. It was the birthplace of the arts and culture, and it had given rise to the most perfect artistic portrayals of human life. This was how the art historian Winkelmann had talked about Greek statues in the middle of the 18th century. And in 1795, that famous poet Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, Germany's most famous poet, had described Italy as the land where lemon blossoms grow. He had written, "Know you the land where lemon blossoms grow, and through dark leaves the golden oranges glow? A gentle breeze wafts from an azure sky, the myrtle is still and the laurel tree grows high. You know it, yes? O there, with you, O my beloved, I would fare." And so when Aschenbach feels the need to escape his predictable life in Munich, he thinks to himself, a sudden switch was needed. Happy-go-lucky living, idle days, exotic air, and an infusion of new blood. Then, via Croatia, he ends up in Venice. Thus he saw it again, that awe-inspiring port, that dazzling arrangement of fantastic architecture with which the Republic has perennially greeted the reverent eyes of approaching seafarers. And indeed, it is here that he finds the life of the artist. With his hands folded in his lap, his eyes drifted over the expanse of the sea, his gaze slipping away, blurring and ultimately disintegrating in the monotone haze of desolate space. He had a profoundly motivated love of the sea. As an artist, burdened by an artist's intense labors, he needed rest and longed to turn away from the taxing multiplicity of the external world, to bury his face in the breast of something simple and immense. And he also finds beauty. When Aschenbach first sees Tadzio, he thinks to himself. To his astonishment, Aschenbach realized that the boy was absolutely beautiful. Pale and elegantly reserved, with ringlets of honey-colored hair, a straight, sloping nose, a lovely mouth, and an expression of divinely blessed solemnity, his face called to mind Greek sculptures of the best period. Greek sculptures like the kinds described by Winkelmann. And this is the beginning of his obsession. What do you do in the face of beauty? It pulls you in two directions. It pulls you towards the transcendental ideal, the artist's gaze, a removal and an enjoyment, a distanced enjoyment of the beautiful object, but it's also something erotic. Tadzio's head is described as the head of Eros. Beauty wants to be enjoyed from a distance, and it wants to be sexually consummated. And in his artistic and transcendental obsession, Aschenbach will come ever closer to his own death. While the artistic impulse is an affirmation of the self, the erotic impulse threatens the self. It threatens life. And here Aschenbach discovers the central tension that presides over his own life. His father's discipline and his mother's dark fire. We read, "The distracted Aschenbach could neither conceive nor want anything else than to pursue that creature that held him so inflamed, to dream about him in his absence, and to whisper sweet nothings to his mere silhouette, as lovers do." And as his obsession grows, Venice changes. Its promise of eternal youth starts to look like a cruel deception. Already before arriving, we see how grotesque it can be to try to hold on to the appearance of youth once it's past. Think of the description of the man Aschenbach sees on the boat. One fellow in particular, all done up in a bright yellow summer suit of extravagant cut, a red tie, and a boldly cocked Panama hat screeched louder than all the others in his merriment. Yet no sooner had Aschenbach gotten a somewhat closer look at him than he realized with horror that this youngster was a fake. He was old, no doubt about it, for wrinkles surrounded his eyes and mouth. The dull flush on his cheeks were merely rouge. The brown hair under his colorfully woven straw hat was a wig. His neck a gnarl of sinews, his affectatious mustache and imperial a dye job, the toothy yellow grin whenever he laughed, a cheap set of dentures, and his hands, signet rings on both index fingers, those of a geriatric. And just as the decline of age is masqueraded beneath this veneer of youthful appearance, so Venice, underneath its veneer of life and beauty, it hides death. It harbors the Asiatic cholera. We read, the city had taken ill and was concealing that fact out of greed. Antiseptic is being spread everywhere to hold illness at bay. Aschenbach knows he should leave, but he can't. What is it that holds him there? Well, it's beauty, of course. Beauty is the very essence of his urge for life. It's the essence of his urge for the erotic, for erotic experience. In the internal monologue where he's imagining what he might say to Tadzio, we read, "For you must know that we artists cannot follow the path of beauty without the accompaniment and guidance of eros." And he begins to fear that this urge for the erotic, for life, reduces him to the wildly cavorting savages of his dream. Listen to how he describes them. Frothing at the mouth, they raged, clawing with lurid expressions and ravenous hands, laughing and moaning, stabbing each other with prods and licking the blood from each other's limbs. So this is what Venice has become. It's become a fantasy of erotic abandon. And it's also become a hopeless maze in which he finds himself completely without bearings. And in the end, he dies while contemplating Tadzio, the beautiful boy he can never possess. In 1930, Thomas Mann, observing the rise in popularity of Nazism, gave a public lecture in Berlin. And here's part of what he said. He called Nazism a gigantic wave of eccentric barbarism and primitive, mass democratic carnival brutality, including mass paroxysms, cries from the stalls, hallelujahs, and dervish-like repetition of monstrous slogans until everyone is frothing at the mouth. Sounds a little bit like the realm of the savage that Aschenbach discovered in Venice, doesn't it? And if it sounds familiar to you as perhaps a good way to describe some of the political movements we see today, then that should only underline the importance of looking back and examining what alternatives might have been thought through at that earlier moment in history. In 1933, Thomas Mann went into exile, and he settled in the USA in 1938. First he was at Princeton, and then he moved to Los Angeles, where he lived in a small community of German exiles, philosophers and writers. And in 1951 he returned to Europe after being summoned before the United States House Un-American Affairs Committee, which had been established to try and sniff out anti-communist sentiments among the intelligentsia. So he spent his remaining days in Europe, and he died in 1955.